In Italy, Juventus have won each of the last 8 league titles. In Spain, it's Barcelona and Real Madrid dominating the table and the transfer market. While in the Bundesliga, it's Bayern Munich's league to lose. And in Ligue 1, Paris run away regularly with double-digit leads. And those teams also dominate financially. And now in a post-COVID world, the status of the finances of European clubs is, let's just say, questionable. So is it time for European football to adopt a salary cap? Welcome into the conversation. I'm Andres Cordero. He's Eric Krakauer. How are you, Eric?
I'm doing well. Excited to be doing this.
So I guess the basic question here, Eric, is why would European football even want a salary cap?
Well, let's take it from a pre-COVID world. Let's start there, and then we'll go post-COVID. Pre-COVID world, I think a lot of people were growing or have been growing disenchanted with the fact that you have European giants that are basically gobbling up all the silverware. And then you have the minnows who are solely happy to exist and to compete against those sharks. Well, at least to take the field against them, but not necessarily compete against them. Post-COVID, we're starting to realize as well that not only is the playing field tilted because of those that, or in the direction of those that can spend a lot more, but we're also learning that they're spending way beyond their means. And very often, some of these clubs have actually worked themselves or spent themselves into debt, threatening their very existence.
So I also think it's a bit broader than that, right? It's for the same reason that any sport would want a salary cap. And it's basically 2 main reasons. One, sustainability, because you don't want the financial situation to sort of wobble out of control, like what happened in the NASL in the 1980s in American soccer. And 2, to create some sort of parity so that it makes the competition more interesting for other teams. Now, granted, in European football, you might have European places to compete for and whatnot, but it does I get a sense that people are a little bit tired of watching the same teams dominate time after time. And it's gotten to a point where not only are those same teams dominating their respective leagues, but naturally they're also dominating European competition. You can almost pick out the 6 out of 8 teams that are going to make the quarterfinals in the Champions League just about every year. And it does feel as though the real legitimate upsets are few and far between, and maybe less so every single season. And so to answer the question bluntly, I think it's for the sustainability of European football to potentially avoid the creation of the so-called Super League that we talked about for so many years, and to create some sort of parity. Although I think that second part is maybe less important to some fans of European soccer.
Well, I think the parity is less important to some fans. I don't disagree with you there. Although I do think that parity has been the number one thing in their minds, in a lot of fans' minds. I don't think a lot of people even considered the sustainability situation in European football. I don't think that, or let me say it this way. I think it came as a big surprise to a lot of supporters, to a lot of fans, that a lot of these clubs were spending beyond their means and were on very tenuous ground financially. I think originally the idea of a salary cap was to really level the playing field so that we didn't see, as you said, all the same teams not only winning their domestic competition, but European competitions as well. And actually, we've actually seen a trend, a growing trend, where only the big teams win a European competition. The last time a team outside of the top 5 leagues won the Champions League was FC Porto with Mourinho in 2004. You go back about 10 years, and you had clubs, 10 to 20 years, you had clubs like Steaua Bucharest, Red Star Belgrade. These were teams that were actually lifting the Champions League. Ajax, PSV. That is no longer the case. And the fact that we had Ajax reach the semifinals of the competition last season is such a big outlier that it suggests that we are in a place where no other team, unless they are financed by very wealthy owners, is going to be able to compete at that stage.
So I think in a league like Spain's La Liga, you actually see some examples of both the need for parity and the need for some sustainability. And so in the sustainability angle, you look at a team like Racing Santander, a team that had tremendous history, a team that could compete, that was a regular fixture in La Liga, that got bought out by a so-called rich owner, was essentially blackballed. There were some politics that went into play there, and a team that was accustomed to being in the top flight of Spanish football regularly dropped down to the Segunda B, the third tier, and basically was fighting for its financial life. And so I think that sort of thing hints at the need for a financial structure that allows for better sustainability of clubs that are good enough to reach the first division. And so that precipitous drop, not just to the Segunda, but the Segunda B, hints at some real disparity financially. In terms of the parity on the pitch, you mentioned how European football used to be not quite as not monopolized, but there was more hegemons, if you would. I think in La Liga, you also go back to the early part of this century where Valencia were a team that could compete with Barcelona, Real Madrid, regularly finishing ahead of them. Deportivo La Coruña were a team that could compete. Deportivo were now in the Segunda. That Super Depor team of around 2000 was a brilliant example. And so with the that era, I think with the absence of that one season of Atletico Madrid in 2014 beating Barcelona on the last day of the campaign at the Camp Nou to claim the title, it really has been Barcelona or Real Madrid's league almost exclusively, if not exclusively. And even that Atletico Madrid team had a budget of about 100 million euros more than the fourth biggest budget, which was Valencia at the time. And so you see that relationship between how much a team is spending, what that budget is like, and the performance on the pitch over a 38-game season. And so I think we've talked a bit about why Europe would want to implement a salary cap. I think we'll flesh this out more as the conversation develops. But in order to talk about that, I think it's also worth noting that U.S. is sort of the genesis of salary caps, right? We installed the salary cap in the 1980s. I believe the NBA were the first to do so. And so I think we should talk a little bit about how the salary caps work in the United States and even how they came about. And maybe the history is important here, right? Because why did the NBA install its salary cap in the 84-85 season? Well, it was part of the collective bargaining agreement between the players and the league, but it came in response to almost a decade of really tumultuous free agency. Free agency comes about in the 1970s in American sports. Before that, U.S. sports operated under something called the reserve clause, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. The reserve clause essentially made it so that players had no say where they went. They were bound to their clubs for life. So if you're in the NBA and a team drafted you, you are with that team for life unless they choose to release you. And so it's often called the Larry Bird rule because the Boston Celtics used it to keep Bird in Boston for the entirety of his career. This created a situation where players had no mobility. There were some labor rights issues. There were some court battles. Ironically, it started with baseball, the one major American team sport that doesn't actually have a salary cap, though they do have a luxury cap, which we'll get into in just a moment. But so free agency comes about. And with free agency, what happens is almost predictable. It's that the big market teams that can spend more, absent a salary cap, hoard the best talent, and it creates a relatively weak league. So I was talking about the NASL a few moments ago. I think the NASL is a really good example of what happens when a handful of markets can afford to buy World Cup captain caliber players, the Carlos Albertos, the George Bests, the Nene Cubillas, and Gerd Müllers, in very concentrated markets where, for example, the New York Cosmos and Fort Lauderdale Strikers had 87,000 at a game in New York, but the rest of the league is essentially dying out. They don't have a sustainable model. So what happens in the NBA is, as a response to this free agency and this consolidation of talented, very few teams, they implement a salary cap to deal with that. And we've seen the NBA become a league with a lot more parity over the years. Obviously, the NFL installed its salary cap, but they're two very different types of salary caps, what you see in the NFL versus the NBA.
Yeah, and the fact that you reference the NASL then leads to the conversation about MLS and how they structured the league in order to avoid the pitfalls that ultimately led to the demise of the NASL. So MLS, by the way, before I just go into that, before I forget, you mentioned the Larry Bird rule, and it reminded me of the court case that Jean-Marc Bosman took to the European Court of I forget which European court it was, but in order to allow players the ability to move from team to team in Europe, in the European Union, once their contracts came to an end, because even though his contract came to a conclusion with the club that he was playing for, they wouldn't release him, even though he had suitors that were interested in his services. But going back to MLS, because of what happened in the NASL, the MLS was built essentially on two pillars. The first one, sustainability. They wanted to make sure that the teams, the original teams, would not spend themselves into oblivion. And number two, parity. And they were able to do that because it was a brand new league with many of these teams not existing before it was inaugurated in 1996. Of course, the teams existed a few years before that. And the model has proven to work, even though, of course, like every model, there are certain things that people don't like that haven't worked as well. But you also mentioned collective bargaining agreements in the NBA and, of course, in the NFL. Those collective bargaining agreements have helped MLS develop while maintaining the structure, the financial structure that has made the league, I think, financially viable and successful on a competitive level.
Yeah, no question. And if we could just go back to soft cap versus hard cap, because I think that would be like a good way of talking about what might and might not work in European football, which we'll get to in a moment. I think the model that the NBA adopted or developed was probably the one that is maybe most feasible in European soccer, because it's not a hard cap like the NFL where you're not allowed to spend beyond a certain amount. You are allowed to spend beyond whatever that cap is, but because it's a soft cap, what it does is it has incremental taxes, a competitive tax. It's called a luxury tax, where depending on how much over that salary cap you are, you're going to be paying a higher and higher tax incrementally in brackets, which would essentially disincentivize the high spending teams from spending too much. But you also need a salary floor if you're going to have any sort of parity. So you want to disincentivize teams from going too high over the salary cap, but you also need to have some mechanism that forces owners to pay a minimum floor to sort of create that parity within the league. And I guess my question would be, could you see a hard cap working in European football as opposed to a soft cap like the NBA?
Well, I think the soft cap is more feasible, and we can talk about that in a bit. Hard cap, I'm not so sure, because you essentially have teams with distinctive histories, some that have existed over 100 years, some that over time have established utter dominance, like a Real Madrid, for example. And then you have other teams that don't have major revenues, that aren't competitive, may play in the same league as a Real Madrid. Take an Alaves, for example, or an Eibar. I think Eibar might actually be the better example. And I'm not sure how a hard cap would work with two teams that have such a discrepancy in revenues and player wages, for example.
So I don't think it can. For starters, because you're not talking about sort of each league individually. You're talking about the European Union, the big five leagues, with the exception of the Premier League, all operate under the euro. Sure, it's the same currency, but it would be sort of different tax regimes. It would be different legal jurisdictions. There would be labor laws to factor in there. And so a hard cap seems way too restrictive for the way that European football currently is. You've mentioned the disparity between, for example, Real Madrid, the richest club on the planet, and Eibar, a team who had to expand their stadium to 8,000 seats when they were promoted to La Liga for the first time in their history, actually almost weren't allowed to be promoted to La Liga, not because they were in debt or because their finances weren't correct, but because they didn't have a big enough operating budget despite their finances being quite healthy. And so if you were to implement a hard cap, it actually seems a mathematical impossibility, right? Because how does the NFL do its hard cap? Well, the NFL takes up or calculates all of the revenue collected by all 32 teams, divides that number by 32. So you have this revenue per team. And then they say, okay, 48% of that revenue is the maximum that you're allowed to pay for salaries at your club. If you were to do that in La Liga, for example, or in French football, you would probably have some teams, the rich teams, who are still spending disproportionately more than other teams because the teams down at the bottom don't actually have enough revenue to meet that 48% or that
Exactly.
60% threshold. So you'd have a financial giant competing against a team whose revenue doesn't reach the salary cap. And so I don't think that solves the parity issue. Does it even get them any closer?
No, I don't think it does. And one thing that you left out, I think you included it in your example, is TV revenue. The NFL shares its TV revenue equally, and we've seen that in leagues like La Liga, that simply is not the case. And maybe there's an argument for why that isn't the case. So teams like Real Madrid and Barcelona, they claim that they get a large segment of the viewership because people are more interested in their games and, again, in an Eibar Alaves, for example. But that is the direct result of these teams not having the riches to be able to field some of the biggest stars that are obviously going to attract eyeballs. And if you don't have TV revenue split evenly, particularly when TV revenue, let's be honest, is the number one thing now that inflates player wages and transfer fees, then it's impossible to have that hard cap.
A fair split in, this is a little bit of a tangent, but a fair split in TV revenue money, I think, is a much more reasonable, a much more feasible, and maybe even more impactful way of sort of leveling the playing field. And you can understand why a team like Barcelona or Real Madrid say, listen, we get most of the eyeballs. People are interested in La Liga because of us, and they wouldn't want to share a bigger slice. So I guess it has been reformed of late, just not to the extent maybe that the Premier League has, certainly not to the extent of somewhere like the NFL, where it is just shared evenly across the league. So I could understand why the bigger clubs might not want to share that. But in the interest of what's best for the league, I think that's probably a much more accessible and more immediate reform that can help both with parity and with sustainability.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you would think that those big clubs would also want to have some not competition necessarily, but they want to have teams to play against, because as you've noted, and we know quite well, the smaller clubs, even in top divisions, are some of them are in budgetary dire straits, and that threatens their existence. And if you don't have teams to compete with, well, some people will be happy about that because it just leads to a European Super League, which may seem to be the direction that we're headed in to begin with. But I would hope that most people don't want that. And what they want to see is they want to see clubs that are financially healthy, even if they're at the bottom of the totem pole, that can play in the same league as those giants. And I think that splitting TV revenue, maybe not evenly, but more equitably, leads to that happening.
I would go as far, I'd be more radical, I think, and I'd just say split it evenly, honestly. Like, that's going to be better for the entirety of the league. Players will be able to bring in, teams will be able to bring in higher quality. But we've gone on this tangent for a while, so let's bring it back to the salary cap for a moment. Because I think the other sort of major obstacle toward implementing any sort of salary cap, at least when it comes to capping actual salaries, not like something like financial fair play, which we'll talk about in a moment, which doesn't actually cap salaries, but instead caps losses. But in terms of what obstacles are in the way of a salary cap in European football, the fact that they compete in a sort of continental tournament makes it a little bit trickier, right? Because where do you implement the salary cap and where do you not? Do you just do it at the big five leagues that are, by far spending much more than any of the other European leagues? So would you have the Eredivisie and the Belgian league sort of exempt from this, the Portuguese league? And then does that sort of incentivize players to leave the big leagues to go into some smaller leagues? If you were to implement it continent-wide, if all of European football was under some sort of, as you mentioned, equitable salary cap, does that then incentivize those players to go to China, to go to India, to come to Major League Soccer, right, where they can potentially seek out more money with, for example, Major League Soccer creating the Beckham rule, the designated player rule, that allows them to sort of break the salary cap to sign big names. So the fact that you are competing in the Champions League makes it so, and the Europa League, makes it so that teams have to be able to almost one-up each other financially,
right,
continentally.
And I think that's the reason why you're seeing so many clubs go into debt, especially big clubs that have to borrow lots of money. Tottenham recently, Manchester United, another club, Real Madrid in the past, when they were spending outrageous sums on transfer fees. One of the reasons that is happening is because they want to be able to compete with teams in other leagues that are essentially doing exactly the same thing. So if you see Manchester City spending tons of money on players, and you know that they will then have an advantage over you in the Champions League, which is really the one trophy that every European club now wants to win, kind of to the expendability of domestic leagues, for example. I don't think it would be outrageous to say that Real Madrid a few years ago focused more on winning the Champions League than they did on the league when they had to compete against a dominant Barcelona, but that's a different discussion. So the fact that they have to compete with superstar teams in other leagues in European competition is one of the things that I think would prevent the biggest clubs in any domestic league from accepting a salary cap.
Right. Let alone players will pay. I guess this applies to American capped leagues as well, because different states may have, different tax codes, but it's probably much more pronounced, more dramatic in Europe, where you'll have a significantly different sort of tax, just a legal tax obligation in, say, Italy than you would in France or in Spain. And we've seen players getting into some tax issues over the years, which is maybe why you're exiting into Italy.
Yeah,
let's not get into that.
And let me just add just a very quick point. It was actually one of the reasons taxation was one of the reasons a lot of players decided not to go to Liga a few years ago, because their wages were taxed so much higher than in other countries.
And for years, you've had the same thing with the NBA, where maybe the Toronto Raptors will struggle to bring in talent because Canada's taxes will be higher than in the United States. But let's talk a little bit about financial fair play, because it's a very different way of trying to achieve at least part of what we started off talking about. We asked, why would you want a salary cap? And I said it was two broad points. It's sustainability and parity. Clearly, financial fair play, by capping losses as opposed to salaries, would not in any way fix the parity issue. In fact, it may actually make it worse by sort of cementing teams into their current financial situations. The rich remain rich, the poor remain poor. But it is perhaps a decent model for sustainability, because what it's saying is basically, this is what you're projected to earn, this is what you're allowed to spend. And in a sense, it maybe is more applicable to European football, because unlike the American salary caps, it does take into account transfer fees, commissions for agents, bonuses, the other things that aren't just the brute salary.
Yeah, but if you want any indication of the fight that you would have on your hands if you tried to implement a salary cap in Europe, just look at the fact that FFP is being challenged by clubs in court, because they don't think that FIFA has the authority to do what they're doing. But you're absolutely right. It's all about sustainability when you're talking about FFP. They don't care a bit about parity, although they would probably tell you otherwise. And I do agree that it cements the biggest boys at the top, and it prevents the smallest clubs from moving up. For example, if a smaller club decided to take on a tremendous amount of debt in order to bring better players in order to compete at a higher level, that just doesn't happen. The other thing that it does, and this is probably one of the really good things that FFP does, is it prevents very wealthy owners from inflating the transfer market, which is something that we saw for a long time in the Premier League, with clubs like Manchester City, who would attract players because they would pay essentially double of what they were worth in the market. So that's a very good thing. But because FFP does not address the issue of parity, and I think the lack of parity is one of the biggest threats right now in European football, I just simply don't think it is enough.
So let's get right down to it. I think we want to end each of these on a declarative statement, a conclusion about the topic here. So have at it. What is your declarative statement regarding a salary cap in European football?
Well, I think what's become evident in this conversation is that adopting a salary cap in Europe would not only be very difficult, but you'd have because of the different leagues that you have in Europe, the amount of revenue that they take in, but you'd also have a battle on your hands because the top clubs just wouldn't want to relinquish their grasp on footballing power. So my solution would be a luxury tax, where you implement a bit of a soft cap, and if clubs, the very biggest clubs, spend beyond that cap, and they're able to, they can do exactly that, that they get taxed for that. And the revenue, that tax revenue, then gets split evenly among the clubs that spend below a certain threshold. Does that make any sense? So if I'm an Alaves and I cannot spend beyond a certain threshold, I then become a potential recipient of the tax revenue that has come from the biggest clubs who have been taxed for going beyond the cap.
So I guess my declarative statement is that you're on the right track. The only way that I see a salary cap structure working in European football, because of the disparity that already exists, would be some form of luxury tax. I guess one thing I would tweak from what you said is I don't know that I would create that threshold for revenue sharing of that particular portion, right? So say, just to summarize what you said, teams that pay the luxury cap, that amount of money would then go into basically a fund that would be distributed evenly abroad. Not the rest of the league, but teams that failed to reach a certain expenditure. And I would think that that could incentivize cheap owners not to break that threshold. And I don't think that's what you want either. I think you want owners to bring out the money to try and get as close as possible to the teams that are in the top. And so maybe I might be a little more permissive and just say, split that luxury cap money among all of the teams that aren't paying a luxury cap. I think something close to Major League Baseball's model is what could work, where there isn't really a cap per se, but there is a luxury cap, right? And so, or maybe something like the NBA, where you don't have a hard cap that says you can't, but even that creates problems in that, again, the disparity is so large between a Real Madrid and an Eibar that they're almost not even competing in the same financial league. And so I don't know where you would be able to find that number to make it fair for little Eibar and for Real Madrid, because if that cap is too low, then the rich teams are going to have to slash 40 to 50% of their salaries, best case scenario. And if that cap is too high, then you get back to the problem we said initially, where some of the teams' entire revenue doesn't even reach that salary cap limit, and you haven't really solved anything. So I think with all of these obstacles, we're simply just not going to see a salary cap in European sports. And it's worth noting the reason that we see salary caps in American sports is because of the moment when those caps were implemented. It's almost a reaction, a solution to an emergency. When it doesn't become a theoretical argument about sustainability, but a practical one about a league that's about to fold. And I don't know that we're there yet with European football, but we're getting scarily close.
Yeah, exactly. We're getting as close as we're going to get, unless there's another pandemic in the near future that is going to affect the pockets of ownership. But one thing to add to what you said is that a lot of these clubs in Europe, for example, aren't owned by a wealthy owner, but are owned by supporter shares. So there's something to benefit. When you said, you might have a cheap owner who won't spend a certain amount because he'll want to collect that tax revenue. I think that is a problem that could be addressed with that floor, right? That cap floor that you mentioned before, that owners have to spend above a certain amount in order to be following whatever cap rules you implement, if that makes sense.
With that, we're going to leave it at it. Eric Krakauer, I'm Andres Cordero. Thanks for popping in on the conversation.